Hi, this is Mimi with Triggered Nutrition. Today we are starting our Macromolecule Mythbusters series. And first up, we will discuss carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are one of our three macromolecules. We also have fiber. I keep saying fiber. We also have fat and protein. Carbohydrates are, on a molecular level, they are composed of carbon atoms, hydrogen, and oxygen. So the name is derived from, it means watered carbon, as you might have guessed, and hydrogen, two hydrogens and a water, and an oxygen make water. So basically, you have carbon and you have water. So that's where we get the name carbohydrate. Carbohydrates also employ glycosidic bonds to put two different carbon molecules together. You have what's called a glycosidic linkage, which essentially uses the addition of two hydrogens and an oxygen, so a water molecule, to link the two together. And when we're breaking them, it releases a water molecule. And that will be significant when we talk about some of our myths towards the end of the presentation. So just hold on to that. So carbohydrates are mainly stored in the liver and skeletal muscles. The liver is the main source of glucose storage. So glucose is actually a simple sugar. And we'll talk about that, what a simple sugar is on the next slide or two. But it's stored in a more complex form, obviously, that's more efficient for the body to compact the glucose molecules into a smaller form and then pack it away versus leaving it and it's more of an expanded composition. Which would, of course, limit the amount of energy that can be rapidly mobilized by the body. The other main place of storage is skeletal muscles, and glucose is stored in the form of glycogen here as well. In the skeletal muscles, it's important that we that we have a good store of glucose because that is what fuels, that's what moves our body. The main hormones involved with glucose mobilization will be glucagon. So glucagon is released when our blood sugar drops. So maybe if we're fasting or it's been a long time between meals, sleeping. So glucagon is released and it's a hormone that's released and it stimulates the breakdown of glycogen, which is glycogenolysis. So that's the breakdown of glycogen to its more simple form of glucose, which can then be utilized by the body. And the other hormone that's involved with mobilizing glucose is epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. So think about it. When we have that fight or flight response and something scares us, or we hear a noise in the dark, and we get that sympathetic nervous system reaction, right? The fight or flight response. Part of that is dumping glucose into the body to prepare you for whatever response needs to come next. So I asked a question here: why is glycogen used as a storage molecule rather than storing it in the form that the body uses, glucose, right? If it's so important to be able to utilize these molecules immediately as fast as possible, like in the last example I just gave during the flight or fight response, then why not save it in its most readily active form? And we'll get to an answer for that a little bit later on. So let's sit on that and see if you can answer it before I tell you. And then gluconeogenesis is the other pathway I want to mention here, which is the process of making glucose molecules. Okay, so glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, right? So glucose we get from our food, we get from the breakdown of carbohydrates. And then the body builds it back up into a different carbohydrate called glycogen, and then stores it away in our liver and our skeletal muscles. And then when we need to use it, when our blood sugar is low, when that fight or flight response comes online, we break down the glycogen back into glucose, or we do gluconeogenesis and we create glucose from fatty acids, a glycerol backbone, and the other individual components. They come together to create a glucose molecule. And I think people are fairly familiar with that when they talk about the keto diet, but they don't really understand that that's what's happening. Okay, we got some artwork here. So the structure of carbohydrates. So I did not include actual chemical or actual figures that would show the atoms. I want to keep this as a shorter presentation, but we can definitely talk about it in more specific terms so that you can see exactly how the atom looks. It's actually found in a linear form as well as a cyclical form. Although it's mostly depicted in the cyclical form, you'll usually see either a hexo, so a six-sided ring, or a pentos, a five-sided. So here I've just drawn all of them six-sided to keep it kind of uniform. So the simple sugars are the most basic unit. So imagine just one of these green, let's pretend they're six-sided. One of these green hexoses are a sugar. So this is glucose. It could be so it could be a fructose or a galactose. All of the monomers or the monosaccharides have the same chemical structure. Have the same chemical formula, C6H12O6, but they have different conformations, so they're in different arrangements. Then we have disaccharides, which is two monosaccharides joined together by the glycosidic linkage that we talked about already. So we have a glucose and a glucose. Two of those makes maltose. We have glucose and fructose. One of each makes sucrose. And then we have glucose and galactose. One of each, bonded together, of course, makes lactose, which I'm sure we're all are familiar with that. It's milk sugar. It's found in our dairy products. From there, we move on to oligosaccharides, which can have a different, which is a chain of monomers or monosaccharides. Up until about 9 or 10 would be considered oligosaccharides. And then we have the polysaccharides, which would be more than 10, up to 10,000 maybe, where it can be very, very long and branched, complex chains of monosaccharides. So as we move down the list, going from monosaccharides to polysaccharides, the overall structure becomes more and more complex. And the more complicated it is, the harder it is for enzymes to act on the linkages, those glycosidic linkages, and break it apart. And that action, the mechanism of breaking apart the molecule down to its simpler forms, is called metabolism. That's simply what it happens in our bodies when we eat. Enzymes In this case, we're talking about carbohydrates. So the enzymes would be called amylase. The amylases, or the first enzymes will be called amylases, and they start to work on in our mouth on breaking down these bonds. The more hidden the bonds are, it's a good way to think of it. The more complex the structure is, the more hidden the bonds are, and the harder it is for the various enzymes to come in and break apart the molecule for metabolism. So the less of it is broken apart, the less is absorbed, and the fewer calories that are captured by the body. And that can be good or bad, depending on what your goal is. Many of our non-nutritive sweeteners are really, really big and complex structures. And they're pretty similar to the monosaccharides, disaccharides, and so on that we find in nature. But the chemists will sometimes add these large moieties onto them so that they cannot be easily digested, or that they can't even pass into the places where they be absorbed, and therefore they be excreted through the body, just pass through unmetabolized, and therefore no calories are absorbed. So that's how the structure matters. There's some really great diagrams out there. I probably should have included some better ones than my little scribbles, but there's some really great diagrams where you can see how complex these structures get, especially when we get down to the polysaccharides. They get really big and really complicated, and I think that might help answer one of the questions we have later on. So try to hold on to that fact as well. So carbohydrate types. We talked about what it is, what it does, the molecular structure. Now let's take it up a level and talk about how we interact with these molecules as food, as nutrients. So our monosaccharides, right? The glucose, fructose, and galactose, and the disaccharides that they make, the maltose, sucrose, and lactose. There are others, of course, but these are mostly what we see in our food sources. They are considered simple carbohydrates. So they are very, very easy to mobilize, like we talked about. It's just 1 and 2 put together, or just one unit, as in the case of a monosaccharide. And it's very accessible. That bond is very accessible to enzymes. It's very easy to get that glucose into our blood. And because of that, these are known to cause spikes in blood sugar. It is not a slow and steady release. The body is able to quickly metabolize, and kind of a large amount gets dumped more or less into the blood at one time. And that's usually seen as less than desirable. It can be related to a very frantic, and you get energy, but it can be a very frantic and uneasy feeling of almost too much energy, almost a sense of hyperactivity. And then there's the come down from that, the sugar crash, where you might experience headaches, or feel dizzy, and over time, all of these highs and lows in your blood sugar can introduce problems like diabetes mellitus, or more specifically, I guess you'd say insulin intolerance. Next, we have complex carbohydrates. So that, that will be our oligosaccharides and our polysaccharides. So all the way from 3 to 10-ish up to 10,000 or more linkages put together, and not just in a straight line. They can be branched, and then the branches can have branches. It can get very, very complex, and that's why it becomes difficult for the enzymes to get in there and break up all of those bonds. So much so, okay, well, we're not at fiber yet. So a special type of complex carb is called starch. We've all heard of starch, but what is a starch? So a starch is a complex carbohydrate. So that means that it's not just one or two sugar units. There's many, many units put together in a string, or in the case of starch, it's highly branched. So a starch is a branched carbohydrate, complex carbohydrate that many of the single units that make up the polymer, many of those units are glucose. Remember, we talked about it could be made up of any combination of different monosaccharides, and all of those are monomers that we use to put together like building blocks to make some of the more complex structures. So many of those monomeric units are glucose. And because of that, it's very easy to mobilize as well. Glucose, as we talked about, is the body's sugar of preference. And so when we eat starches, it provides a lot of it. Starches are pretty high in calories, and they are really important staples in our food supply, especially in countries where there's food insecurity, or where it's just a different type of access than what we're used to in America. It's very important to have foods that are high in starches because they provide a lot of calories and usually at a lower cost. So think potatoes, think rice, think pasta, think bread. Those are starchy items that have a lot of glucose, which is specifically what the body is looking for. So once again, that's in just like the simple carbohydrates, that's an area to be concerned with if diabetes is something that you have or are at high risk. I'm sorry. If diabetes is something you have or at high risk of having. And I don't think I gave you examples of the first two. So I'll go back and say, well, simple carbohydrates are refined sugars. So when we flip our items to the back and we look at the nutrition label, simple carbohydrates are going to be any type of sugar or honey or substance like that that's added just for sweetness. Under the carbohydrate section, it'll be listed out as refined sugar. That's simple carbohydrates. All of the candy, all of anything that has sugar in those top two or three items listed on the ingredients list is going to be a sugar heavy food product that, again, you might want to limit or eat in a more structured way because of the implications to the blood glucose. Complex carbohydrates don't mobilize as quickly, and that's your whole grains, that's your whole vegetables, your whole fruits, your seeds, more of naturally occurring sugars. And then we talked about starches. So next we'll finish this slide with fiber. Fiber is a very, very interesting one. And I think it's pretty misunderstood as well. I don't know if everyone knows that fiber is a carbohydrate. I think it's listed, it is listed on the nutrition label under carbohydrates, but I think that only adds to the confusion. So fiber is just like starch. It is a complex carbohydrate, but fiber is completely undigestible. So fibers, there are different types of fibers, lots of different types. Fibers are so complex and they're so branched. The branches have branches have branches, and the body is not able to, not only is the body not able to break it down, but the type of monomers, I'm sorry, the type of monomers that are used to make the fiber also makes it difficult. So fiber has two different types or forms. We have insoluble fiber. It absorbs water, and it helps to bulk up our stools and to make them softer. And a lot of this has to do with, if you think back to the first slide when we talked about what a carbohydrate is and how the glycosidic bonds are formed, right? So if you remember, we discussed the two sugar molecules being added together by a glycosidic bond. And that glycosidic bond is formed by the addition of an OH and an H, which together is a water molecule. So carbohydrates attract water, and they, in this way, because it's not being broken down, it's staying in it's undigestible, so it's staying in its complex form. It attracts water to your stool, which helps it to be bigger and bulkier, and it also helps it to be softer, right? The more water, the easier it is to the more water that is included in your stool, the softer of a product it is. So we've all had constipation at some point, and we know that it's a really dry and difficult product to pass. And then we also have, and so with insoluble fibers, we think of, again, the complex carbs in terms of potato skins and apple skin and broccoli, and like the skin of fruits and vegetables. Our whole grains, once again, is a good source of fiber. Beans, I will put them more in the soluble category. And so that brings us to soluble fiber, which is more active in delaying stomach emptying. So I don't know if you've ever had a fiber supplement like, what is it called? Metamucil in the orange container. So you scoop it out some and you pour it into your 8 ounces of water. And the best advice is to drink it as quickly as you can, because it has soluble and insoluble fiber. And if you let it sit, the soluble fibers will absorb water. Well, I'm sorry, will expand. That's the word. I'm sorry. They'll expand in water and make it more of a gel, a really thick gel-like consistency. So chia seeds, if you have chia pudding or flax seeds as well, anything that's high in soluble fiber is going to create like a gel consistency when you put it in water. And that thicker consistency, when it's in the stomach, it delays stomach emptying. It makes the same type of viscous fluid in the stomach, and it makes everything take a little bit longer to pass through. So in that way, we stay full and satisfied longer, and may consume less calories, or enable fiber as a meal replacement if our goal might be weight loss or weight management. The soluble fiber, that gel-like consistency, also helps with movement of stool. So not so much bulking or softening, but the gel just helps things to glide and move smoother in our systems. So the nutrition of carbohydrates, we're getting to the end now. The recommendations are to have 45 to 65% of our daily calories from carbohydrates. Now, this is a very, very general recommendation. This is based on a 2,000 calorie diet for someone who is not trying to lose weight or manage a condition or with any type of special goals. This is just at baseline for maintenance. The general recommendation as a starting place is 45 to 65. I think that's a bit high, especially with what we know about carbohydrates being involved in inflammatory processes, and that many of our carbohydrates are not coming from whole grains and whole foods, but mostly from processed food products. I think we have to be careful with how we operationalize percentages like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with one of the Mythbuster questions coming up soon. So the 45 to 65% of daily calories on a 2,000 calorie diet would be about 200 to 300 grams, with the carbohydrates giving the body 4 calories for each of those grams. So that's about 800 to 1,200 calories just in carbohydrates. So that doesn't include any calories gleaned from fats or proteins or alcohol, just in carbohydrates alone. Of the 200 to 300 grams, only 25 grams for women and 36 grams for men should be taken from refined sugar. So those are going to be your monosaccharides, your glucose, your fructose, your galactose. I don't really see galactose too much, but you should only have added sugar to this extent on a daily basis. And to show what that looks like, I've included a line here about, where is it? Oh, okay. So, and to show what that might look like in your diet, 1 can of Red Bull, just the average size can, is 27 grams of sugar. Just 1 can. That's all the added sugar you get all day. So nothing for dessert after dinner. Skip that smoothie after your workout. No cream in your coffee. This is it. Or 27 grams of sugar is about what you find in 1 large sweet potato. Are these the same? You can pause here and answer. No, they're not the same, right? Because from what we've learned, the 27 grams in the Red Bull are refined sugars. They're simple sugars. If you look at the ingredients list, it'll say sugar or high fructose corn syrup or sucrose or whatever mono or disaccharide is included to add the sweetness. In a large sweet potato, there's no nutrition label. That's because the sugars are complex carbohydrates that are naturally occurring. They are not refined. They are not added. They are part of the plant's natural production of glucose. And that's a good way for us to modulate our carbohydrate consumption. I think a lot of the bad information is not necessarily bad, but it lacks depth. So we just hear the message that carbohydrates are bad, but we don't talk about why. And when you do kind of talk about why, it makes it more clear to those listening that there's only certain carbohydrates that we want to limit and certain ones that are actually good for the body, like fiber. We talked about that. That is a complex carbohydrate, but that's very good for the body. It's good for the bowels. It's good for the heart. It's good for diabetes. And we'll talk about that some more too. And yep, perfect segue. And the recommendation for fiber, which is a complex carb, is about 30 grams a day. So obviously, we want to limit our simple carbohydrates, and we want to maximize our complex carbs. So now the fun part, fact or fiction. Are low carb diets a good way to manage type 2 diabetes? You can comment below. Tell me what you think. So the answer is no, that's not true. Research has shown us that eliminating carbs or trying to achieve a low carb diet is not the best approach. The best approach, based on evidence, is a consistent carbohydrate diet. So with that diet, your dietitian or nutritionist will help you decide what is an appropriate percentage or number of grams of carbohydrates for you to have over the course of a day. That will be broken up into the number of meals that you have per day, or snacks, I guess I should say. And then over the course of the day, you will receive a consistent number of carbohydrates across your meals and snacks. Now, what this does is helps to alleviate spikes in our blood sugar. The spikes in the blood sugar is what is bad for our blood vessels, and that's what leads to insulin intolerance. We do not want our receptors to downregulate in response to blood sugar, to glucose in our blood. So we don't want it to constantly be there. We don't want the sugar to constantly be in our blood. We want to have our bodies get used to a certain amount, a set amount, and get used to releasing enough insulin for that amount, and have that done over the course of the day, the course of a week, the course of the month, and that will help your body to regulate, right? We want to be consistent and give our body a chance to I want to give our body the ability to kind of plan for what our metabolism will need, if that makes sense, right? We don't want to take a whole bunch of sugar at breakfast, eating pancakes and syrup and, the typical American breakfast, and then go hours without another meal, or continue to have large amounts of carbohydrates at every meal. We need carbohydrates, but we want to have our body be able to handle them when they come in. And the best way to do that is to let your body train itself to handle a certain amount and then keep it there. And those amounts will change as your weight changes. If you're putting on muscle, your metabolism might change. And as we age, those things change. But they're slow and consistent changes. And that sounds like an oxymoron, consistent change. But those things change slowly. It's not like here we dumping a bunch of sugar in one meal and then tomorrow we go down to nothing and have a low carb diet. We don't want to do that. We want to work with our body and help it to do the best it can. In addition to being consistent with the number of carbs we're eating at each meal and snack, we also want to think about the types of carbs that we're eating. So it's important to have complex carbs, to have fiber, to have whole grains and whole foods. And it's important to limit the simple sugars. It's hard. I know for a lot of people, they say it's hard to completely cut out processed foods. But as much as possible, we want our carbohydrates to not come from processed foods, but instead from from closer to the ground, the whole sources. So this one, I think we'll say is a myth. It's not true. Are all carbs sugars? Yes, all carbs are sugars. Yes or no? Tell me below what you think. So this one, I would say, we answered it over the lecture. No. Yes and no. All carbs, all carbohydrates are all carbohydrates are a system of monomers, either linearly or branched branches. And they can be, most of them can be broken down to their most simple and basic unit, which is a sugar, but all of them cannot be. So actually, no, all carbs are not sugars. They are made of those simple monomeric units, but such as fiber, they cannot all be broken down to that unit. I've heard a lot of, like I heard someone say that carbohydrates are 50%, like they break down a 50% sugar, or some different numbers and ideas about that. And for the most part, I mean, it's not a closed system, so there is some waste. But for the most part, our carbohydrates break down to the sugars, and we're able, unless they're non-nutritive, which they're made that way on purpose to not be digested. But for the most part, the naturally occurring carbohydrates are broken down into sugars and utilized in the body as glucose, except for the ones that are highly branched and complex, like fiber. So no, all carbs are, yes and no, all carbs are made from monomers or from monosaccharides, but not all carbohydrates are digested as are metabolized back to that to that simple form. I hope that made sense. Gluten-free solves all carbohydrate sensitivities. And I'll just go ahead and say no, that's not true. So carbohydrates can be very irritating to the body. I mentioned inflammation, carbohydrates being, especially simple carbohydrates, being involved in pro-inflammatory processes. And they can be congenital, so you can be born with them, or they can be acquired. You might have, and gluten is not the only culprit. So gluten is a specific protein found in some carbohydrates, some grains, that can be irritating. It can flag your immune system and cause irritation in diseases like Crohn's and celiac. But there are also other ways that our body can negatively respond to carbohydrates, such as enzyme deficiency. And those, like I said, can be something you're born with or something that you acquire over time. Certain procedures like gastric bypass or procedures that impact your gut microbiome could also impact how your body metabolizes and interacts with carbohydrates. So no, if you think that you're sensitive to carbohydrates, you might experience some malabsorption, might be experienced as bloating or flatulence or just a very uncomfortable feeling. It could be, even for me, I have eczema, which is an immune disorder. And when I interact with carbohydrates, it flares my eczema. So if you think that you're having a response and you're already gluten-free, don't count out carbohydrates because it might still be the issue.